In this session, I'm going to talk about the country risk assessment. What are the things that needs to be taken care by the risk analyst while he is going forward in terms of designing the tools or practices for assessing the risk in a particular country. So, just to look at some key considerations for an analyst in case the analyst is going ahead in terms of designing the tools or practices for effective risk management or effective risk assessment in any particular country. Whatever the tool that is designed, it should be easy to understand kind of stuff. It should be straightforward, right? It should be understandable. It should be straightforward, and it should be easily communicatable. Any model that is getting designed should obviously have these kind of key aspects, and of course it should be coherent. It should be usable with respect to other due diligence mechanisms that are being followed. It should be compatible with other due diligence mechanisms that are being followed. It should add more value to the other mechanisms that are being used. So, developing of this model from an analyst standpoint, how many variables to consider, how many variables to use as a part of this model building. The more the number of variables I am using, probably there is a big huge breadth into it, but at the same time what there is a cost that goes into it. But at the same time I have to see, do I need that much of level of detail? Is there, by adding a few more variables, is there any additional value addition? So it's a compromise between the level of detail that you want to provide versus the breadth of the coverage. So think of a sufficient number of variables to be included. Along with that, a proper mechanism suggesting the interconnectivity or interconnectedness between each of these variables, the correlations existing between each of these variables. What are the assumptions that are driving each of, why, what is the prime reason why you had to go in with each of these variables, and what could be the bias that this particular results are going to bring out? What are the limitations associated with the current model? What kind of biased results that can come with the current model? What are the things knowingly omitted as a part of including into the particular model? All these things need to be quite comfortably understood and documented for the purpose of from the perspective of any model that is getting developed. And just coming to more specifics of each of these models, I can design more and more of qualitative models. There are so many qualitative models that are in place. Along with that, there are many quantitative models also that are available for assessing a specific risk of the country. There are so many formula driven, statistically driven statistical models. There are so many mathematical models considering various variables, various combinations of the variables, but majority of the models are primarily driven by a focus on economic growth, where a perspective of GDP and those aspects being looked at, and at the same time there are models which are focusing on the economic health of the country, more right from numbers associated with inflation, unemployment, interest rates, then unemployment, interest rates, the production, the service sector, all these things being quantified and looked at as a model which talks about the country specific risk. Whereas from the qualitative dimension, there are models which are focusing on a color coding mechanism. Right, there is a color coding mechanism of assessing the risk of each of the country based on a numerical code. There is a green, blue, yellow, red kind of mechanism that is present, right, where the numeric code for a specific country is 90 or above. Then probably we are talking about green zone, 70 is blue, up to 40 goes yellow, and less than 40 is more like a red kind of a zone. That's a kind of color coding mechanism that is there for each of the country from a risk dimension. And red is those kind of countries which have a heavy risk with respect to either international law, are probably being branded as more and more of terrorist kind of countries, or which are very heavily producing some kind of weapons, biological, nuclear kind of weapons. A lot of prohibitive activities very heavily running in those countries. They are all receiving the ratings of 40 and below, getting into the red zone, whereas the ones which are in the green zone typically are more and more favorable for investments, and from a country's perspective they carry the least amount of risk from multiple dimensions. Similarly, there are some grading based rating schemes which are typically provided by your S&P and Moody's kind of rating agencies. They provide a grade to each of those countries, again based on the various aspects. So like this we can have so many kinds of qualitative models for assessing the country risk. Along with that, there could be a quantitative dimension also which focuses very heavily on the economic growth and economic health of the country. Now, in general, what we could typically see is the various risk factors, whether we are considering the qualitative or quantitative mechanisms. There are almost 16 key risk factors that are being considered, whether you take it on a qualitative scale or on a quantitative scale. These are the major factors that go forward in terms of assessing the risk of the country. Probably one, the economic environment in the country. What does this economic, how does it contribute towards as a risk factor? The more and more open, if the economy is more and more open, it is having the least amount of risk, and the more and more closed the economy is, probably it is subjected to more and more country specific risk because investments cannot flow into that particular country. Similarly, from the investment environment, right, when I'm talking about the investment environment or a trading environment, I'm more looking at from terms of exports and imports of that particular country. The more freely the country is able to do exports and imports without too many controls or something, the country risk is much lesser with that with respect to that particular country. Then we are looking at it from a financial dimension. From a financial dimension, the higher is the debt associated with the country, the more it is exposed to country risk. Then when I'm looking at the local environment in the country, the higher the country is prone more and more to natural disasters or some kind of catastrophes, or some kind of very high corruption in the country, or discontentment among the people or among the workforce. All these things will obviously increase the country risk of that particular country. Then the next dimension we can look at is the development that is happening in the country. Primarily looking at the infrastructure growth, or change in increase in the or decrease in the poverty levels, increase in the gross national income, closing of the gap between the rich and the poor, some kind of developmental activities that are coming up. Probably the middle income people typically going up, middle class typically going up, or people below the poverty line moving to above the poverty line. All these things are indicators of lessening of the country specific risk. Then we are also talking from a cultural dimension. The more and more stronger ethics are there, no racism, no specific to a particular caste, creed, homogeneity in the people without any discrimination on the basis of caste, creed, sex, race, whatever it is. Then the country risk is much lesser in those particular countries. Then we are talking about geostrategic considerations, where we are talking in terms of politically or military wise, the country is very strong. Well, army wise or the political wise, it is very strong. Obviously, the risk is much lesser in those kind of countries. Then we are talking about social the social gatherings, as well as the cultural attitude of the people towards the other. If that is more and more improved, the country risk is much lesser. More political stability existing in the country, the lesser is the country specific risk. The more and more smoothened election process, or stable government for 5 years period, all these things are adding more and more towards the lessening of the country risk. Even the people specific risk or personal specific risks, more and more working population, and more employee friendly kind of labor laws and rules that are specific in a particular country. All these are contributing to a lessening of the country specific risk. Similarly, currency fluctuations, exchange rate, the more and more stable it is, the lesser is the country risk. Then similarly, the legal structure of the country, the more and more robust is the legal structure of the country, and probably the independence between the legal as well as the banking system of the country, the independence of the banking system from the political influences, all these things lessen the country risk of the country. Then similarly, asset specific risks in terms of ownership requirements that could be given, foreign direct investments that are allowed in that particular country. Or similarly, we have supply specific risks, or probably operation kind of risks in that particular country. And finally, there could be security related risks. All these things, if they are understood quite heavily in terms of building of a model, country risk assessment can be done in a very robust manner, whether you are using a qualitative mechanism or a quantitative mechanism, whatever may be the mode of design. All these different aspects of risks need to be considered, which will give more and more robust multi-dimensional country risk analysis. And apart from that, we also need to talk about some alternative measures. We are also talking about some kind of alternative measures for assessing country risk. So there are so many other mechanisms, other tools that are generally used. One is corruption perception index, a very important index. From the corruption standpoint, We can evaluate the countries where they stand, right? This is based on some 13 independent surveys, public sector dealing with the public sector corruption of 178 countries. So 0 to 10 scale, the rating comes up with. 0 means highly corrupt and 10 means almost not corrupt kind of stuff. So in general, what we are seeing is poor country, unstable government, and history of war. They are looking out for more and more corrupt kind of countries. But at the same time, even a well-developed country is also getting more and more into corruption because the public sector is joining hands with the private sector in terms of increasing the corruption in that particular country. Then the countries can be analyzed on the basis of a democracy index, which is again a measure of how to what extent the country is democratic. So it has again, this is something that has focused on civil liberties, election process, and the government functioning. Then this has focused on political culture and political participation. These five dimensions are being looked at by this democracy index. Again, the countries are classified into more democratic, highly democratic, to almost no democratic, means more and more of authoritarian kind of regimes. So from a regime dimension, from the political dimension, from the country's freedom kind of a dimension, this index can really help us. Then there is another thing that is focusing on freedom in the world index. So this index was primarily focusing on assessing the country whether it is more and more free. There's a lot of freedom, or it's more and more lacking in terms of freedom. So primarily looking at two major dimensions: the political rights in the country and the civil liberties. Again, this is one more dimension that can typically help in assessment of the country. Then we have another measure called Gini coefficient, which is talking about social inequality in the country. I can directly use these kind of measures to assess which country is more and more socially equal or socially unequal. This is focusing more in terms of income and wealth, right? So probably more and more inequality. Obviously, we can say the more and more inequality existing in a country, more tension is going to be generated in the country. The only thing we have to understand is the inequality need not mean poverty. There are so many countries which are heavily rich, but a heavy amount of inequality exists among the people. Lot of discriminations based on caste, creed, sex, race, all these various aspects. So even that needs to be considered. Then there is a global peace index which talks about the peace in that particular country. What kind of external conflicts? The higher the external conflicts, the worse it is. I mean, with the borders, tensions in the borders continuously, or very heavy spending on military. The higher the military spending means the peace levels are much lesser in that particular country. The higher the crime, violence, all these things, the lesser is the peace that is existing in that particular country, and they are very high risk prone kind of countries. So even that needs to be that can be one more measure for us. Then we can also look at human development index, which is generally a focus on the education levels in the country, the literacy levels, then it focuses on the income, the mortality or the life expectancy and the standard of living. All these things talk about the human development index. So it again classifies the countries as least developed to most developed kind of countries. This can be used as an input for our country risk assessment. And then we also have a measure with respect to youth unemployment levels, especially covering the people between 18 to 30 kind of age. So the more unemployment existing means more risky in future dissatisfaction levels, and all these things will grow up, means that country is prone more and more to the risk, and it is not worth investing in those kind of countries. So whenever we are trying to do the assessment of a country specific risk and trying to compare the risks of multiple countries, all these things, both qualitative and quantitative kind of stuff, can be considered for a thorough country risk analysis. If you have any further queries regarding the same, you can get back to me by giving me a call on the number that I have provided below, or you can send in an email at vamsidhar@pacegurus.com. Thanks a lot for listening to this session. Thank you very much.